I just picked up some new wheels and my fitment absolutely sucks. These are Titan7 T-C5 wheels. In the rear I have R35 tires 325/30/20. In the front I have 285/35/20. And right now I am on totally stock suspension, and there is about a 2-finger gap in the front and rear. The rear looks okay-ish, the front not so much. I picked up the Swift lowering springs. There are 2 versions for this, so it's really important to make sure you have the correct one for your car. They make one for the earlier models of GTR up until 2014, and then since I have a 2016, I picked up the 2015 Plus. Surprisingly, I have seen a lot of videos on GTR lowering springs, but I have not seen any specific to the Swift springs, so we're gonna do a pretty in-depth DIY today installing the springs, and then we'll go through the process of getting the car aligned because I know there can be some difficulty with some of the lowering options. So unfortunately, to get started with this, we actually have to take the interior out. The top bolt for the rear struts is unfortunately behind the trim piece here, so we have to take the whole back seat out. So I'm gonna start by removing the seats and we'll get into it. So to start, the actual seats themselves are clipped in, so we should just be able to kind of pull these up and they'll pop off. There we are. And you can see there's sort of a little pull tab here on the bottom, and if you just give this a little tug, that releases this clip here, and then the seat comes right out. Now we want to remove the actual back of the seat. There's a 14mm bolt at the bottom and then 2 clips on the top. Next up, we got this little panel here in the center, which should just be pressure fit in. Yes. And then there is a cable behind here. Rather than taking the plastic clip itself out, I just found it easier to remove the actual screws for the bracket itself. It's just 2 Phillips heads, and if you're doing that, much easier. Now we want to remove the actual speaker surround. There are 2 10mm here that are holding it in. Next, we want to remove the actual speaker surround, and this should just take some force, but it should pop right out. Suspiciously easy. So now we need to take off these side panels, and it's pretty straightforward. It's just this push pin here, and there should just be some kind of clips on the back. And we will have to remove the door sill trim a little bit to get it fully out, but we'll start with this push pin. It didn't fall into the abyss. So just be able to kind of finagle it out here now. There we go. Wow. No broken clips. So the next step in the process is actually to remove this whole upper portion right here. It is being blocked by the seat belt, which has a bolt we have to remove. Once that's done, there is the hang your clothes hook, and there's a little Phillips head behind that we'll want to remove. After that, it should just pop off nicely. So we'll start by removing the cover on the seat belt, and then it's a 14mm bolt that we can just go ahead and remove here. Yeah. There we go. Off to the side, and then we have our friend right here, and this is just a kind of hard to see Phillips head, and this should just pop off, and there you are. The only remaining step here in the disassembly of our interior is to remove this big plastic piece here. There are 4 Phillips heads towards the front that we'll just need to remove, and it should be set free. Fun. Done. Woo! So there are actually 6 screws. There are 2 on the top here, kind of underneath the seat belt. So I'm gonna take those out, and then we should be free. Now we can remove this. Oh yeah. And I'm just gonna kind of leave it dangling here because all we really need to get to are these little aluminum foil covers here in the corners, and that's where the top bolt's gonna be for those rear struts. The interior is removed. We have actually done the other side of the car, so we're gonna do the front and rear on the passenger side now. It's pretty straightforward, honestly. The rear is much easier than the front, but it's pretty darn straightforward. We didn't have a ton of struggle with anything, but we are gonna call out a few tips that'll make your install a little bit easier. That would have made ours easier if we had known prior. So let's get the car up again, and we'll get working on the rear. Oh, wow, huge wheels, it's heavy and hard. With the wheel off, we're gonna remove the 3 bolts on the top of the strut, and then there's just 1 more on the bottom, and it should be free. The weird thing about this car is there's this kind of like aluminum foil that covers the top of the strut area, and you kind of just have to peel it back to expose the bolts we need. Super weird, but very straightforward once you have it. And again, we'll just kind of peel back kind of gently. Be careful not to get it stuck to anything. So you will see there is a cable in here that is attached to the strut, and that is the EDC cable, which controls the electronic dampening. We just have to remove this little connector. That should pop off, and then we can remove the bolts and we'll be good. There we go. That is now out. There's a little like plastic tube that covers this. You don't have to worry about the tube. With that, we can take our 3 12mm off the top. And the weird thing about this car, again, is these bolts are kind of covered by this like top metal piece here, so you kind of have to get them in at an angle, which is unfortunate, I would say, but not the end of the world. I would recommend getting them loose with the ratchet, and then once you're done with that, use your hands to get the bolts off, just because there's sort of a bottomless pit down here and you do not want to lose anything. And I'm just kind of feeling it. You can't see anything, so I think doing this by feel is probably the best you'll get. And I think this interior stuff is the worst part of this job, honestly. And now we're done. So back to the outside world. The remainder to get the strut out is pretty darn easy. All you really have to do is remove the bolt that attaches the strut to the rest of the assembly here, 17. And you'll probably need a breaker bar. This is torqued on pretty aggressively. So I think having a breaker bar makes it quite a bit easier. And we will have to push, all the leverage I got from the breaker bar really paid off here. All right, and this is a pretty long threaded thing, so good opportunity to have some conversation. All right, and it is free. Pop that out, and our strut is literally ready to go. The big thing is there may be something holding the wire for the EDC cable on the interior of the car. On this side, there was not, which was interesting because there was on the other side. So just be mindful when you are taking the strut out of that cable. Taking the strut out is pretty darn simple. Just kind of wiggle it, honestly, until it kind of pops free. You'll probably have to move it off of here first, so towards the bottom, give it a good whack. But you can see I'm already free, and now it's just a matter of kind of maneuvering it outwards. There we go. And there you see, we have our strut, our EDC cable, and we are ready to swap out the springs. There is a 17mm here at the top that we need to remove, but before we do that, we want to make sure our spring does not shoot upwards and cause damage to our roof or our bodies. And to do that, we'll put a spring compressor on here. There isn't a ton of load on the spring to begin with, but to be safe, always use a spring compressor. You do not want to be one of those Instagram Reels or TikToks of someone making a very stupid mistake when they're doing their suspension. Before we totally dive in and start disassembling things though, a very important note to make, and this is where we ate up a lot of time when we did the other side, is make note of where the position of the bolts is on this top hat relative to where the bottom of the strut will connect to the lower control arm, because this is sort of directional. These bolts need to be in the right place when you're putting this on so everything's square, and this top hat does spin freely, so if you do not take a picture, a mental one or a physical one, you will likely have to play with it a little bit to get it all perfect. So we're going to take a picture and reference that when we're putting it back together. We got the Harbor Freight spring compressor, pretty easy. You put 2 of these on your spring, give it a little bit of load so it will not fly off when we take the top hat off, and we're all set. That should be pretty good. I'm not super concerned about that. So one of the nuances with the GTR suspension and really any modern suspension is cars that have EDC have to have connectivity to the vehicle's computer to change and function like you want them to. And because of that, on this, there's a cable that sticks right through the top bolt. If you have a traditional socket, you're not gonna be able to get it through because this cable is right here. So making a dramatic entrance, we have the strut socket. And I didn't know this existed until recently, but that top bolt is a 17mm, and this socket has a pass-through for the wire, so we're able to use this freely with a normal ratchet, and it won't give us any troubles. I highly, highly, highly recommend this if you're doing it. Since the top hat and the rest of the strut are kind of separate mechanisms, when we try to remove that top bolt, it's gonna try to spin the top hat and prevent us from taking it off. So what we can do is if we take a wrench like this, and between these two screws, and you'll have to kind of do this based on the direction you're spinning it, but kind of create a sandwich at an angle like this, it'll be a lot easier when we take our wrench through to kind of fight that torque and take it off more immediately. Oh, baby, woo! And with that free, we can just kind of remove it like we normally would with our spring compressor. We don't have to worry about this shooting upwards. So I will go ahead and get moving. And then now, with a little wiggle, this guy should come right off. So the next piece of the puzzle is putting the spring on. These are pretty nicely labeled. It's pretty easy to indicate which way is up based on the logo. And we'll start by just passing this through, feeding the wire in. And now the second thing we really want to pay attention to is where the bottom of the spring sits. So you can see it's a little bit notched right here. And what we can do is just kind of make sure we're really sitting in that notch. Not like going over the notch, but just kind of comfortably sitting right in there, because that's where the OEM one was sitting as well. The next sort of challenge with this is now that we have the new spring on, we need to thread the EDC cable back up through this hole, but that's pretty difficult because I do not have tiny hands. Mr. Bros for Speed, thank you for kind of discovering the technique, but he used a chopstick to kind of push the cable through here. We just have an old rusty clothes hanger. Always have an old rusty clothes hanger in your garage, but if you start by just kind of poking this through the end here, and you will see our friend here at the top. We can kind of use this to just pull the EDC cable through. So what I'll do, I'll take the strut, and then we will use our blue tape to tape this onto the end, and we can just kind of pull it through. That's probably sufficient. Now we can take our top hat, and we take our clothes hanger, and we should be able to pull everything through. Here it comes, there we are. Beautiful. And with that, we can kind of slide everything back into place. So you'll notice this doesn't sit back down exactly like it came. And the reason why is this little top hole will only let the bolt sit in one way. So if you notice I spin, it'll plop down right there. That is the only way it will kind of fit in here. So that's a nice thing Nissan did for us. Now is where our picture really comes in handy. We want to make sure that everything is aligned the same way from when we took it off the car. That means that you want to make sure the top bolt aligns with this bottom opening here where it sits in the control arm. That alignment is really key on putting everything back together. So what I'm going to do is first make sure our spring is seated in the correct position, which it is, good. And then from our reference picture, we had one bolt sort of sitting out parallel to the bottom opening here. So I'm gonna spin this a little bit, and you'll notice it does spin. It will only really wanna spin in one direction, but if I take this and spin it forward, I want it about perpendicular with the opening, and perpendicular we are. So we are good to tighten the top bolt up. We're kind of back into the same setup we had when we were taking this off. We have a wrench under to kind of prevent it from spinning. The torque spec is 44 foot-pounds, so I got my torque wrench set to that, and we'll go ahead and tighten it up here. Oh. Woo! 44. So it's time to put this back on. It's pretty darn simple to switch and replace the spring. The big thing to note here when we are putting it back on, again, making sure everything matches where we took it off. And if you're not sure which direction the strut needs to go, if you look here, there is a threaded side and a non-threaded side. The threaded side will always go towards the front of the car, and the bolt will go in this way, and that just gives us a little bit more room to ratchet it and tighten it when we're all set and done. Whew. It is time to reinstall everything, and if you'll notice, you'll see no one in the shot right now, and that is because this is a two-man job. Patrick is going to be here on the bottom threading the strut upwards, and I'm gonna be on the top tightening those 3 bolts. Again, making sure that EDC cable is kind of poking through, and then I'm just gonna kind of loosely tighten the 3 top bolts. and then we'll try to get that bottom one in, and then we'll torque everything up. Okay. Eyeballing everything. With the top 3 bolts vaguely attached, we can put this big bottom guy in between the strut and the lower control arm. It's a little bit weird to line this up. We used a jack on the other side, but I don't really think it's necessary. So just do your best to line it up, and we'll screw it in. Oh, that was good. With this bolt, the only part that's threaded is the end piece. So I got it in. Sometimes you have to twist a little bit to get everything perfectly aligned, but I got it in, and now the only remaining portion is just the threaded bit, so I'm gonna use my ratchet and get that in. It may take a little bit to get everything perfectly aligned, but just be careful, be patient, and it should be all good. Now all we have to do is torque everything down, so I'm gonna start with the 3 top bolts. The torque spec for those is 29 foot-pounds, and then that bottom bolt is going to be 55 foot-pounds. So we'll go ahead and do those now. And don't break your windshield when you do this. There's one. 29, 29. Beautiful. And we're all set in here. Nice, 55. The only real other step here for the rear is to reconnect that EDC cable and then to button up all of the interior pieces we ended up taking out. We still have the front to do, so we're gonna wait on that before we reassemble things. All right, so we also have a little bit of disassembly to do in the front. Unlike the rear, we actually can see the 3 top bolts we need to remove, but the problem is the EDC wire goes through this hole and it connects back here, so we actually have to take this whole panel off in order to get the wire free. So they're just 5 plastic clips, and I'm just gonna use a comically long flathead screwdriver to pop those up, and we should be good. There's that one. So you'll notice that we are getting a lot looser, but we're still kind of on here with this panel, and the reason for that is because, as Nissan clearly indicated to us, clip behind. I think that is the funniest warning ever. So we'll go ahead and pull this off. It just takes a little bit of pressure. And you'll notice as well that this top part's gonna kind of want to pull off, and that's just because the weather stripping is here, so we can kind of pop this off again. There's some little clips. And it'll pop right off for us. And we'll just want to go as far as this panel is. And then we should be able to, with a little bit of oomph, take this right off. And that flies off for fun. I actually lied to you guys. Behind the battery cover, there's one more clip. So in order to remove the EDC cable, you'll notice it's kind of below this other harness right here. So we actually want to kind of pry this out of the big grommet, and then we'll be able to free the EDC cable from behind. So I'm just going to kind of pull up. Again, everything's kind of pressure fit in here. It's not the most fun thing to play with these cables, but it's fine enough. Just be careful not to put too much tension on anything, this harness or the EDC cable. And you can see now it's sort of wiggling free right here. And we just need a little pick tool, just like we did in the rear, to pop this off, and then everything will pull through. The other thing we want to do with the cable disconnected is to kind of thread it through, because again, we're going to need to take the whole strut out, and this is connected. So we'll just go ahead and pull that through, and now we are free. The only other things that are preventing the strut from coming out are just the 3 bolts, but we got to take care of the bottom first. There's a lot more for us to remove on the front strut than the rear, which is a little bit unfortunate. The first thing we want to start with is the wheel speed sensor, and that's just this cable that kind of wraps around here. And basically there are 5 grommets. The real thing you need to pay attention to is what would get in the way of the strut if I tried to remove it, and most of the places where this cable is mounted will do just that. So I'm gonna start with this one, and they're just kind of pushed in here, so you can kind of use a flathead or even just your hands and kind of wiggle it out and pull. There we go. 1, and again, there are gonna be a few others, and they're all just kind of gonna be wrapped around. You can see the actual cable right here, and it just has these mounting points, and all they kind of do is just keep the cable out of the way from stuff that's moving, and we just again want it to be freely disconnected from the strut. The only other thing we need to disconnect as far as cables and things that get in the way are concerned is this thing that attaches the brake line to the strut here. This is just a 12mm, and we'll just kind of let it dangle once we're removed. Yeah. So this is a deep socket. You will not have a good time if you're using a standard depth socket with this one. And this bolt is on so tight for some reason. But it is now off, and with that, it'll kind of just come free. And you can see there are little notches that kind of hold it in place. So when we're putting it back, we just want to make sure we line it up with those notches. So now we want to remove the two probably trickiest bolts from this whole installation. And that is the bolt that connects the strut to the lower control arm and the end link to the lower control arm as well. These are both 17s, and we will need a wrench to hold in the other side, and then our trusty socket to remove the bolt itself. So use a breaker bar for this. You'll need to put some force behind it, but aside from that, it's pretty simple. Start with the end link, because that is the easiest one. And we are free. In preparation for removing all the things, I'm just gonna let the bolt with the struts hang around for a little bit longer, since it's easier to have some compression under it to take it out. But there's a 14 millimeter up here at the top that connects to the upper control arm, and we're gonna remove this, but we're not gonna push the bolt out just yet. We're kinda gonna let everything come out together when we're fully ready to take out the strut. And there you have it. That one is removed, and we'll leave the bolt in for a little bit later. All right, now we are going to take off the 3 12 millimeter top bolts. This is super easy, and keep in mind there are some washers underneath these bolts. So just make sure you keep track of those washers as well. Whew. Now we are ready to kind of let everything go and remove the strut. So as you remember, we still have this top bolt in, and we still have the bolt connecting the strut to the lower control arm. We're gonna kind of tap those out here to start. It's easier if you have a little bit of compression underneath the kind of whole assembly, so we're gonna jack it up just a tiny bit. Again, no need to be super crazy with anything. And once everything's kind of loose, everything's gonna kind of wanna flop around and be a little crazy. So what we recommend is have some bungee cords ready. It's really important to mount this kind of upper assembly to the control arm, just so you're not stretching any of the joints and boots and all that kind of stuff. So be slow, be careful. It's a little tricky to take things out, but it is doable. It is much easier to remove the upper control arm bolt first. That allows the lower control arm bolt to be punched out a lot more easily. Do be mindful that everything will kind of flop about once you do that, but you're in much better shape to remove the actual strut. Removing the front strut is probably the most frustrating part of this whole process. Again, it took us 2 people and maybe 20 minutes to take it out. The reason it's kind of difficult is just because how little vertical clearance you have when you're doing this. So the big thing we've kind of learned, having done this twice now, is the first thing you want to do is get the top 3 bolts free. You can do that by pushing the upper control arm out of the way, and you can kind of pull this out. Once this is out, there is not enough vertical space for you to continue pulling it all the way. So what you need to do to create that vertical space is to push this end as far forward as you can. You kind of want to tilt it. And to do that, you can push the lower control arm down a little bit. Again, being as careful as you can be, not to damage anything, but push that down. And with that, you can kind of push this forward. And once that's kind of done, you can kind of rotate everything out and around and out. That's what we ended up doing. And then once things are all wrapped up, just make sure you bungee cord everything to the upper control arm, just so nothing is flopping about. But a little frustrating, not the end of the world, and with some patience and the right technique, you'll be in good shape. So now we want to replace the front spring as well. The process is almost identical with the rear, so we're only gonna show what's differing, and the only thing that differs is this guy here at the top, which is just sort of a little protector for this little top bolt. So this first thing, you can just kind of pull up, everything is sort of pressure fit in, and then this guy as well here at the bottom is also kind of pressure fit in, and you can use a screwdriver to kind of pop this up and free, and it slides out, and we're all set. The remainder of the process is exactly the same. We have finished reassembling the strut. The top bolt is again torqued to 44 foot-pounds, and it is time to put it back in. Remember, the checklist before you put this back in is this in the same orientation as you started? For example, the bolts lining up with the opening here, you just want to make sure it's exactly where you started. For us, it's this bolt being perpendicular to this guy down here. Make sure your spring is set in the correct location down here, which ours also is. So we're basically ready to reverse the steps from earlier on to get this back in. We're gonna start by getting the top bolts through the holes in the top of the car. Then we'll wanna get this as close as we can, and then we can try to just fiddle with things and get everything back in its proper home, then we can torque it down. We have maneuvered our strut back in, and it's a little bit frustrating and time consuming, but if you just follow the angles and steps we laid out, it's pretty straightforward. We have the top 3 bolts are just kind of hand tight right now. Everything else is lined up, so we're gonna start by putting in these big bolts again, making sure everything's in a good spot, and then we'll just torque everything down. With everything reinstalled, it's time to torque everything up. The first thing we want to torque is these 3 bolts here on the top, and those will be 28 foot-pounds. Now we just need to tighten the top bolt here, which is going to be to 41 foot-pounds. With that hand tight, let's get it torqued to 41. 41. That's the sound of 41 foot-pounds. And then the end link and the bolt for the strut are both torqued to 79. It gets a little tricky to get in here, but I'm gonna get them hand tight first and then we'll torque them down fully. 79 and 79. Now the only remaining step here is to reinstall the little grommets that hold the wheel speed sensor in place. So again, just kind of right back where you found them, and the cable will kind of dangle in the place where they need to go. And then after that, we have the little brake line holder here, and this 12mm just needs to be torqued down to 16 foot-pounds. So we're gonna go ahead and get moving. Oh, excellent. And that concludes the front. Aside from putting the stuff back in on the top, including the EDC cable, we're all set down here. The painful backbreaking work is over. We are officially done with the grueling hard part on the floor. The only step we really have now is in the front. We need to make sure we reconnect our EDC and button everything up in terms of the plastics and grommets that were removed. On the rear, we have a little bit more to do, namely reconnecting EDC, covering up our tinfoil, and then just kind of in reverse, putting the interior back in. Should be really straightforward. So we'll get back to you when the car is all cleaned up, and then we're gonna talk a little bit more about alignment, because with these lowering springs on the R35, it's a little bit of a hot debate, and we'll get into it once I have some numbers for my car. It's been a few days since I've dropped the car, and one of the things I really wanted to talk about was just the alignment on the GTR. It's sort of a hot debate what type of work you need to do to get a proper alignment once you've done something like lowering springs. One of the concerns I had with lowering the GTR that I'd read up on Facebook and other forums is that you'd have too much camber in the front and rear, and that the tires wouldn't really wear evenly since there's less contact on the asphalt. While you can remove a lot of this negative camber with an alignment, one of the concerns GTR enthusiasts have is that you can't get enough to bring it back into the GTR's OEM spec. To help give you some additional camber adjustments, one of the things people really like to recommend on the forums are the cheapest option for the front, Whiteline camber bushings, and these will replace the factory bushing on the OEM upper control arm, and that will just give you a little bit more flexibility, almost half a degree of less negative camber to help you resolve that alignment there. In the rear, one of the things people really recommend are camber links. Some even say the Whiteline camber bushings in the front aren't enough, and that you have to replace the entire front upper control arm completely to get back into spec. And the unfortunate thing about that is that's maybe $2,000, $2,500 in upgrades, and having spent $600 on springs and $3,000 on wheels, that's not something I was really excited to do. I wanted to see exactly what kind of camber numbers I would get after I dropped the car, so after a few days of letting it settle, I took it to the alignment shop to see what the results would be, and I was actually pretty surprised. As far as camber is concerned, for the front you're really looking at a range between -1.7 and -1.3, and for the rear you're looking at -1.6 to -1.3. And my camber did change a little bit, but it's not so out of the OEM spec that I'm really concerned. Having an extra half a degree of negative camber isn't really the end of the world, and one of the advantages of something like this is it looks a little nicer, it makes the wheels look a little bit more flush, and everyone kind of loves a cambered setup. I've driven the car around a few times after getting the alignment, and I will say I'm really happy with the results. Not only did it really dial in the fitment, it gave me about an inch of drop, and that's exactly where I want it. Not too high, not too low. And the thing I really like is it makes the car feel a little bit more aggressive. And when you're changing the dampening modes between Comfort and the R mode, it feels a little bit more dramatic, the change you're feeling. Comfort is a little more posh, and R is a lot more stiff, and you're getting a little more direct feedback from the road, which I really enjoy. Anyways, let's check out the GTR and see what it looks like lowered with the new wheels. I am super happy. If you liked the video, please leave a comment, like, and subscribe.